Imagine sleeping on the hard ground in a dense jungle, barely getting any rest because at any moment you could be bombarded by enemy fire, caught off guard and unprepared in a place that you're not accustomed to. This is what the American soldiers in the Vietnam War had to endure. After performing thorough research on this war, I believe I can accurately inform you about what took place. This is also a topic that can interest a variety of people because it's a unique historical event and it's something that not only impacted America, but other countries as well. So today I'm going to take you through how the Vietnam War started, how America got involved, and the growing hatred the American people had for the war, and finally how the war ended and the impacts that it had on the country. So to start off, we'll start talking about how the Vietnam War began. During World War II, Japan invaded Vietnam, which had been ruled by the French since the late 1800s. So as a result of this, a man named Ho Chi Minh started the Viet Minh, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam. He was a strongly communist man, so he based this off of the Soviet Union and Chinese communism. Fighting ensued, and in 1945, Japan withdrew its armies. So with just the French left to fight, the Viet Minh quickly took over a major northern city, announcing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh as the president. The French quickly took over the south, and fighting resumed. But the French were defeated, and during negotiations at Geneva, Vietnam was divided, with the Communist Party taking over the north and the French taking over the south. In 1955, according to History.com, a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a severely anti-communist man, took over the South as president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Now, during this time, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US was becoming even worse. So because of this, President Dwight D. Eisenhower vowed his support for Ngo Dinh Diem and his anti-communist regime. In addition to this, he provided training and equipment from the US military. So with this, Diem and Minh began engaging in firefights, which would soon become much worse. So now, moving on from the beginning of the war, we'll go into how America really got involved. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy provided even more aid to the South Vietnamese in the form of personnel and equipment. In 1965, after several more increases in US aid, and after the murder of Ngo Dinh Diem, President Lyndon B. Johnson finally decided to send in US troops for combat. By June of this same year, 82,000 troops were stationed in Vietnam, with a call for 175,000 more to be sent by the end of the year. According to PBS.org, the fight in Vietnam became brutal very quickly, with airstrikes and ground fighting in the dense jungles going on all over the place. President Johnson made multiple attempts for peace treaties with North Vietnam, all of which were rejected. By the end of 1967, the amount of troops in Vietnam was nearing 500,000, with about 15,000 deaths and over 100,000 wounded. At this time, there was also about 52,000 civilian deaths. The American people grew to hate this war, not only for the impacts that it was having on the American people, but for the damage that it was causing the Vietnamese civilians as well. Men began to flee the country because they wanted to avoid the draft. According to HistoryPlace.com, the amount of anti-war rallies on the home front increased dramatically from the beginning of the war to the end. In addition, the troops themselves began to question and mistrust why they were even in Vietnam. The number of mutinies and attacks by soldiers against officers grew immensely from the beginning of the war to the end. So moving on from the heat of the war, we'll go into how it ended and the impacts that it had on America. So in 1969, President Richard Nixon began the Vietnamization of the war, which was bringing troops out of Vietnam in multiple stages and reducing the draft calls. So by 1972, this process was completed and America had lost its first and only war in the country's history. By this time, America's total death count was over 47,000 in combat and over 10,000 non-combat. And the wounded, there were over 150,000 of those. So for the impacts, there were a variety of them, starting with the Congress made an all-volunteer-based military force rather than having a draft. The voting age was reduced to 18. The War Powers Act was put into place, which required the president to get approval from Congress before sending in U.S. forces into combat. The U.S. economy, of course, took a hit because we went through a cycle of immense inflation after the war. Americans were extremely wary of getting involved in other countries because they didn't want another Vietnam situation to occur. The war divided the Democratic Party, undermined liberal reform, and it made Americans distrustful of the government. The veterans of the Vietnam War have been the most impacted of all American veterans in history. When they came home, the American people, both supporters and non-supporters, dealt them very harshly, or treated them very harshly because of what had occurred overseas, whether it was their fault or not. They have also had the highest rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and homelessness of all veterans in American history. Even today, there are divided opinions on this war. A recent poll of the American people has shown that 53% believe that it was a mistake that had good intentions to begin with, and 43% believe that it was just completely and morally wrong. So in conclusion, we went over how the Vietnam War began as a fight against communism, how America got involved, and the mounting hatred the American people had for the war, and finally how it ended and the impacts that it had on the country. No event in American history is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War, said President Richard Nixon. This quote speaks to the fact that the Vietnam War was and still is one of the most controversial events in American history. Thank you.